Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. Before we get to today's episode, we want to take a quick moment and let you know that CityWorks Expo 8, Anticipating 2050, Acting Today, will be occurring October 4th through 6th in Roanoke, Virginia. We've got some really exciting speakers and some other activities lined up that we're excited about. If you all are interested, please check us out at cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. But now, without further ado, let's get on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Ms. Nadia Owusu, Associate Director for Learning and Equity at Living Cities. How are you doing today, Nadia?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Doing well, although as you mentioned before we went on air, the rain certainly saps some energy on days like this.
Yes, it does.
Well, I wonder if you can kind of start us off by telling us a little bit about how you define the work that you do.
Sure. So Living Cities is an economic racial justice organization. We are really focused on closing racial income and wealth gaps in America's cities. And I lead both our learning and research portfolios. So we make grants and impact investments and partner with cities around the country. And we're really focused on capturing what we're learning from those efforts and sharing what others are learning as well. And so that's one of the portfolios I lead. And then the other body of work that I lead is around racial equity and inclusion and what it takes to operationalize racial equity within the work of different kinds of institutions. So part of my work is focused on making our own organization more equitable. And part of it is focused outward on building a field of practice around racial equity and inclusion.
That's so many fascinating things to dig into there. But one of the things that I find so compelling about your guys' work is that, you know, you've really worked on some concrete steps that can be taken. And as someone who likes to think both big and small, that's really compelling that you guys have been able to do that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you guys have gone about kind of creating a playbook, so to speak, of ways to kind of address these massive issues.
Yes. So we were really engaged in doing work that is now called collective impact. Before that term was phrased. And what that really just looks like, the brass tacks of it for us is we don't want to sort of helicopter into cities. We're a national funder, but we really think that work in places should be led by the people in those places. And so we really look to support cross-sector leaders in cities who are taking on some of the biggest issues that their cities are facing, whether it's economic development and inclusion in their economic development work, whether it's sort of homeownership or entrepreneurship. Data and technology is another area of focus for us. But we really want to work with partnerships of people in cities who are taking on those problems collectively and each holding themselves and each other accountable for a bigger result. So that's really what the work is about. We believe that that's what it really takes to make sustainable change. And what we try to do is support those teams of leaders in those cities with technical assistance, with grant dollars, with impact investments where that's appropriate, and also connecting them to other leaders in other cities who are taking on issues of economic inclusion, poverty, and sort of building a community of practice around that type of work so that people can sort of leapfrog and not have to make the same mistakes across cities. And so what we have really done is worked really closely with the partners that we support to capture what they're learning in real time. We think that it's too late to wait 10 years into an effort. The kinds of efforts that we support are really long term. We won't see results for 10 or 20 years. And so it doesn't really make sense to wait 20 years and then put out a nice, clean and polished report after the fact that people can't really make use of while they're grappling with the same problems in another place. And so a big part of our work is focused on capturing the learnings from those places. We do everything from interviewing folks. We've changed our grant reporting so that it's really not about compliance, but is about what are you learning, what are you seeing, what were the failures and successes. And we have a really robust communication strategy and network weaving strategy to try and get those learnings out into the world as fast as possible.
I'm really intrigued with how you guys as a funder work in that long-term space, because that's obviously a space that most funders and most projects as a whole are not particularly prepared to work in, that 10, 20, 30-year space. And so I'm wondering kind of how you guys do that in terms of recognizing that the results you're looking for now or the project that you're funding now, may need to be long-term, or the fact that you may need to make a short-term investment for hopefully a long-term gain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. That is always a balance that we have to work out. And I think our belief is that short-termism, and particularly in terms of philanthropy and funding social change efforts, is a big problem and a big contributing factor to the reality that we're not getting the results that we want to see in places, particularly on issues like poverty, that there is no quick fix for that. And so we're fortunate in that we are a funding collaborative of foundations and banks who work together through us to sort of pilot new ways of working in cities. So we kind of are, in some ways, a research and development arm of some of the biggest foundations and financial institutions who are investing in social change in the country. And that gives us an enormous amount of flexibility, because often our funders will do things through us that they wouldn't do on their own. For example, we sort of helped pioneer the Pay for Success field, which is a new-ish way of funding or investing in social change efforts using private sector dollars as well as public dollars if the initiative is successful. But those are the sorts of risks that we can take on because we are a collaborative. It allows us to have a longer view. We're not constantly fundraising, which is a real difference in terms of how we get to work. And we're really grateful for that, because that means that we can stay the course in places. And the expectation of our funders is not that we're sort of churning out quick programs, but more that we're trying to understand. Our charge is really to try and understand how long-term sustainable change happens in places. And as you said, it is also really important to see results or to see at least the promise of results, and to capture that sort of learning as well, and to have measurable results all along the continuum of change. And so we do have sort of short-term results that we're looking for in the places. We encourage the groups that we partner with to invest in those short-term wins, because they can often work to bring the communities along and to sort of earn goodwill, and also to see those short-term wins and that work as a contribution to a longer-term strategy.
Well, I'm intrigued. Some of the work that we've done down here at Roanoke has been focused on these supporting and fostering innovation projects, and I wonder, speaking from a personal level, I wonder how you kind of deal with that in terms of some of the stuff that we've had is really you don't necessarily get to be there boots on the ground to see the successes, but you know that you're supporting it. And so I kind of wonder how you manage that case of, you're not necessarily there doing the hands-on work, but you're supporting it even though you're not necessarily seeing it on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's really true for us, and is a struggle for a lot of our staff, many of whom come from more direct service work. And so that distance from the ground is something that we're constantly wrestling with, and trying to understand how we can measure, or how we can think about measuring outcomes, particularly from where we sit. And the way that we sort of think of our role is as a critical friend to the folks who are doing the work on the ground. We really try to support leaders. We know that change is not going to be led by one Superman leader, but rather a coalition of leaders. And so investing in leadership is really important to us. Because we invest in leadership, we develop strong relationships just on a personal level. All of our staff have strong relationships with folks from the cities that we work in because we have been working with them over time, and because we try to offer our own sort of resources, not just in terms of financial resources, but also in terms of thought partnership and processing and relationship building with other folks who they would like to connect with. And because of that, we're in kind of constant dialogue with the people who are doing the work in places, and really try to center their experience in terms of how we communicate about our work as well. And so our research and communication strategy is really focused on lifting up the work that they're doing, which requires us to spend time with them, really processing what they're seeing as they go about their day-to-day work.
So I'm wondering how you guys kind of wind up in particular communities. Is it a thing where someone comes to you with a project that you find compelling, or is it more often there's a group of individuals that you think are up to interesting things, or kind of how does that relationship get started?
It varies. So one of our biggest investments, the Integration Initiative, started as a competition. We were really looking for cities, as I said, who were already doing work in this cross-sector way. And so we launched a competition to select cities who were doing that kind of work, and specifically doing that kind of work towards addressing poverty and inequality. In other cases, we hear about exciting efforts in places and try to figure out how can we support that and scale it and potentially spread it to other places. So certainly we do get calls or emails from cities that are doing exciting and interesting things, and try and figure out how can we make that work more sustainable, and then how can we bring whatever innovations we're seeing to as many places as possible. And so an example of that model of working is that we recently heard about some efforts in Cleveland to not just do the sort of collective impact type of work where it is cross-sector leaders, but to really engage all of those leaders, which means sort of the heads of institutions in Cleveland who are working together to address inequality and poverty, and bringing them through basically a year-long process of training in anti-racism concepts and analysis. So they're all going through this journey together, which their hypothesis is that it will make their work that much stronger because everyone will be able to apply a racial equity and inclusion lens to all of their decision-making. And we're just really excited about that model. We heard that New Orleans has taken it up after hearing about it from Cleveland. And so we're just pretty certain that there are other cities who would be interested in trying this. And so right now we're trying to figure out, okay, what does it look like to grow this network? And what does it look like to support both Cleveland and New Orleans in telling the story of that work and capturing what they're learning along the way? So those are a couple of ways that we've worked. We also partner with some of our member institutions on specific programs that they might sponsor in addition to their general contributions to living cities. So for example, we have a partnership with the City Foundation, and that partnership is focused on fostering innovation and accelerating innovation in cities on a specific issue area. So there's been a few cohorts of cities focused on different topics, one focused on procurement, one focused on infrastructure finance, one focused on community engagement. And so those are ways for us to sort of in a shorter term way support cities that are taking on a particular issue and just accelerate their learning by connecting them to each other.
I'm really intrigued as I hear you talk about these different cities, whether they be Cleveland or wherever, that you're mentioning them as cohesive units, which I find fascinating. And I'm just wondering how much of that uh, are you working with government, or how much do you think government needs to be involved? And kind of how do you bring that government versus civil sector versus private sector into the equation?
Yeah, so because we believe that cross-sector efforts have been the most successful in terms of addressing large-scale issues in cities, um, we tend to work with coalitions of private sector, public sector, and philanthropy and nonprofits and community organizing in cities that are working together. We strongly believe that the government, local government, has to be at the table because they are the biggest funder of the kinds of efforts that we care about, and their resources sort of dwarf any resources that we can bring to the table. And until we can get more private sector engagement and figure out how to better harness private sector resources for good, they remain sort of a very important and key player in these efforts, and often are the conveners. So some of our efforts have local government kind of at the center, and they actually convene the mix of private sector folks and local philanthropy and nonprofits. And so we do have, in addition to sort of our cross-sector efforts, we have particular programs and initiatives that are focused on public sector engagement and public sector sort of capacity to solve big problems. And so one of our initiatives focus on the public sector, for example, is called Racial Equity Here. And that's an initiative that is partnering with cities who are really working to apply a racial equity and inclusion lens to all of their policies, practices, services, through staff training, through capacity building, through using different tools to help them understand how they might be inadvertently or not contributing to inequitable outcomes in cities. Another public sector focused initiative that we have is called the Project on Municipal Innovation. And that program brings together chiefs of staff from across the country twice a year to kind of engage with each other around the toughest issues that they are seeing in their cities and to kind of problem solve together. And actually the City Accelerator initiative that I mentioned earlier is kind of built on top of that network of chiefs of staff because we select the cities to be in those cohorts from that network because we have deep relationships with them and we know that those cities are really committed to these issues. So we really believe that we have to invest in the public sector as a key player in these efforts, and that largely what we're seeing is that they are the ones who are actually best able to convene other partners and actors towards these cross-sector efforts.
I think that, as I hear you talk about these communities that really imbue everything they do with a sense of racial and economic and social equity, I'm wondering, this is a country that's as divided as it's ever been in some ways. And I'm wondering kind of how you guys have been able to articulate that need to communities, or whether that's something that at this point you guys are largely working with communities that kind of already grasp the need to deal in this space.
Yeah, I mean, we do tend to work with a coalition of the willing, and we're hopeful that through working with people who are really committed to addressing these issues, that we'll be able to lift up stories that can help bring other cities to the table. But more and more, we're seeing that folks who are working within city government are already thinking about what it means, particularly in this time, to ensure that that they are working towards racial equity and addressing inequality, because we're recognizing that cities are, for now, if not always, definitely the place where change is going to happen, and where we're really going to, if we're going to see these issues addressed in a meaningful way, that often it's going to happen at the local level. And so we are partnered with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and it's a growing network. I think that they have about 75 committed cities, many of them the largest cities in the country, that are focused on racial equity and inclusion and learning with each other about what it takes to make city government more equitable. And so yes, I think we are definitely working with a coalition of the willing, but it is a growing movement across the country.
Well, I'm intrigued to know kind of from those folks that you guys have worked with, if there are particular things that have really stuck out to you as potential best practices, or kind of where you, if someone comes to you and say, hey, we want help with this, what can we do? Where do you guys point them, and where are kind of some of those starting points?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting things about supporting the racial equity work around the country, and particularly working with local government, is that there have often been sort of spark plugs who have been trying to advance this work for a long time within local government. And so one of the things that we have found that has been really helpful for cities is to encourage the folks who the mayor has potentially appointed, whether it's a chief equity officer. Many of them are sort of new in their positions. And so one of the things that we say to them is identify those spark plugs. Who are the people who have been pushing and organizing from the inside of local government to get more equitable outcomes, and start with them. So that has been something that that we've seen over and over again. Another thing that I would say is that often, and this is not just local government, it's other kinds of institutions as well, our institution included, because we are certainly not experts on racial equity. We have been on a journey that has taken us from being an organization that was largely race neutral, even though we were working on poverty across America. We never really talked about race. And over the last 4 years, we have really changed our mission and vision, because we've invested in, as a team and as a community, understanding the intersections between race and poverty, and really wrestling with the root causes of the problems that we're taking on. And that has looked a lot like sort of a personal reckoning as well as institutional reckoning. And one of the things that we have seen is that often institutions will make a public statement of the institutional commitment to racial equity and inclusion, but not do the work required to support staff on a personal level, sort of reckoning with their own role as gatekeepers, as contributors to inequities, and as people who wield both formal and informal power. And so we have seen that when you invest at both levels, on the institutional side and also on the personal side, through staff training and coaching and shared experiences and developing shared language and analysis, you really do get better results.
That seems in some ways to be a microcosm of what you're trying to do with some of these communities in some ways. And it's fascinating to me because it requires a certain level of organizational or individual humility on some level to understand, hey, we didn't understand this as well as we could have in the past, or hey, we messed up in the past and now we want to do it right. And I wonder kind of how, if that's a space that many communities are willing to be in, or kind of how you can encourage people to accept that humility and understanding of mistakes in the past.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the cities that I mentioned, Cleveland and New Orleans, that's very much what they're doing. They're sort of, each of the institutions that are part of that effort are recognizing sort of their own complicity in creating the inequitable outcomes, and really working hard to figure out what their role has to be in making change. And all of the cities in our Racial Equity Here cohort, which is focused on local government, one of the really amazing things has been seeing how they have, as part of the grant, we've asked them to write a historical analysis of their city using a racial equity and inclusion lens. And that documentation has been just amazing, because they really have reckoned with the role of government in creating economic inequity, whether that's through redlining, whether that's through zoning, but they really have sort of sat with the history of inequity in their places. And I think writing that history together collectively and wrestling with it together has made a huge difference in those places. But you're absolutely right. It does require a lot of humility. It requires a turning of the mirror on yourself. And that is something that is hard for any institution and for any person. But, as I said, we at Living Cities have been going through that journey for 4 years, and it's resulted in a reframing of our mission and vision statement. It has really focused our work in a way that it wasn't before, and in many ways has built transformational relationships among staff members that have really enabled us, we believe, to do much better work together. And so it is really hard work. It can be really humbling, but we think it can be really transformational as well.
Well, I'm also, from that same perspective, I'm imagining that no two communities are going to walk through that process, or no two organizations are going to walk through this in the same way. And so I'm wondering kind of how you guys allow people to see the frameworks that have worked in the past, but also understanding that it's going to be different in your space, and encouraging people to contextualize those lessons that they've learned from other places.
Yes, definitely. Everyone's journey will be unique, and every institution's journey will be unique. And what we do is encourage the partners that we work with, and we are also committed ourselves to sharing what we're learning as we go, so that people can take what's useful and kind of discard what's not useful to their particular context. There are some tools that we can provide. So we have started sharing, for example, a simple equity impact analysis tool that the Government Alliance on Race and Equity has used, that is just a set of questions that you ask yourself as you're making decisions, and that can really help help you to sort of guide and focus your own analysis of your own contribution to racial inequity. And so providing those tools can be a good place to start, but often the work really starts with relationship and starts with organizing within institutions. And so we really do lift up the leaders who are willing to kind of take on those risks and try to support them as much as possible, because they're the ones who best understand the context in which they're working. So we can provide sort of a historical analysis at the national level. We can share data that we've collected over time. We can encourage the cities themselves to collect their local data, whether that's using data released by the Urban Institute, or Policy Link has an equity analysis map that you can look at and see what inequity looks like in cities across the country. But a lot of the work is going to be, you're going to have to figure it out as you go.
Well, I'm wondering kind of, this requires in some ways this vision for the future of what we could be. And I'm wondering, when you think about what that future could be if we were to embrace these issues and really come to grips with them, what do you kind of envision if we're looking at 2040, 2050? What should we be looking to accomplish? Or what do you think can be possible?
So I think racism is at the root of so many of the problems that we're trying to solve. So I think a future in which we're able to address poverty will be a more empathetic, a more tolerant future. And so I think what you would see is communities across income and race really coming together and sharing accountability for their own survival and future. And we're seeing sort of across the country, we're seeing glimmers of that possibility, whether that's in Detroit, where they undertook, I think it was a couple of years effort to create a plan for what the future of their city will look like, what an equitable Detroit looks like, how to ensure that they're not leaving folks behind. And that was a really collaborative effort that included the voices of communities from across the city, as well as leaders of institutions. And so I think I think for us, the future would be much more of that, much more listening to community about what their needs are and how they envision more equitable places where people can really thrive and grow and support their family. And so that's sort of our vision of cities as places of opportunity in the truest sense.
Do you, that's obviously, it feels a long way off. It feels like every time we take a step forward, we take another step back. And, particularly at this time, it seems really hard, and for me anyway, to see that future in some ways. And I'm kind of wondering how you guys maintain hope, or how you encourage people to continue dreaming big, even at a time when it may look impossible.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to work at Living Cities and not have hope, because we get to spend so much time with people who so deeply care about the future of their communities, and seeing sort of unusual partners working together in different ways is another thing that is sort of like a glimmer of what's possible. And so I think one of the things that I would say for anyone who's sort of losing hope because of the current climate is to find any effort in their community, whether that's as small as a community garden or as big as a large scale anti-poverty initiative, and sort of get involved, talk to people, and do some organizing themselves, because I think that the best way to see what's happening is to talk to people on the ground who are committed to leading these efforts. And it really is easier than one might think to find those kinds of efforts around the country. They're everywhere.
I would absolutely echo that and encourage anyone that's listening that's interested in getting involved. There's almost certainly a way to find to get involved. I will, this is, again, a little bit of a personal question for me, but I'm wondering, I'm a very much a person that likes to have concrete steps and know kind of how to move forward. But I also know that some of these questions, particularly regarding, racial equity, where we have these long histories of harm and oppression, involve a good deal of healing and time and conversation that doesn't necessarily know where we're going. And I'm kind of wondering how you guys encourage people to balance those times when you're not necessarily sure where we're going together versus the times when you really need to take concrete action.
Yes, that is definitely tricky. I think what we've seen is that it is helpful to have a plan. So that's something that we've learned from the cities that we're working with on racial equity here, is that once they did their sort of historical analysis and their data analysis of what the past and the present look like, as well as beginning to do some visioning for what the future can look like for their city that would be more equitable. What they do is then they develop a plan of action that can serve as a reminder of what they're trying to move together towards. And then, the only thing that we can really say then is that, there might be times that you have to pause, and that the best next step is to have a long conversation, bringing different partners to the table, because these problems have been generations in the making, and they will take time, but you don't want to lose sight of that forward propulsion. And so I think having a plan can be really helpful, as well as having a clear sense of ways that you can measure at least sort of glimmers of success. And then being willing to sort of pause on the plan as needed to continue the much needed dialogue and reckoning and healing that has to take place.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. Well, I'm wondering, I'm very intrigued from seeing in your background that you've done some work in Africa, and I'm wondering kind of how that may have informed some of the stuff that you do now, and how that different maybe vision of community helps inform kind of the work that you do these days.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So my father is from Ghana, and I actually grew up in East Africa because my father worked for the UN. And so much of my sort of early years and upbringing was in an African context, plus having an African family. And one of the things that I think you were kind of touching upon in the question is that we in Africa tend to be a collective culture and a community-focused culture. And I think that is part of why I have always had in my professional career a passion for working with groups of people who are working to solve problems, because this notion of communities taking care of each other is just sort of ingrained in my background and culture. I also think what I learned from working in microfinance in Africa is that sometimes the smallest actions can lead to much bigger change. And so I have seen how small loans, for example, have led to women organizing and collaboratives, and so that has always been something that I've held on to in my work here as well, which I think is connected to why I believe it's important to, as well as thinking big, as you said earlier in our conversation, also focusing on what are those small wins, what are those small first steps that we can take together. And then another thing I think is that often in the African context, you're sort of unencumbered by sort of the history of the kind of work that you are doing. And so I think sometimes in the American context, we get really stuck on this is the way that we've always done it. And so this is how we're going to continue to do it. And I think because of sort of the need to be innovative and resourceful in Africa, there's sort of a culture around leapfrogging old solutions and trying to find something new that works in that context. And so that's something that I think about a lot, as well as the fact that something that is innovative in one place might be old in another place. And so innovation in and of itself is not something that I value very highly. It's more about what is the right solution to this problem.
But, I'm just intrigued. I'm always intrigued by people that have different cultural backgrounds and what that brings to bear. And I think we are seeing very clearly, as you say, that different places we see different things as needed, and things that we thought we had learned. Perhaps we need to go back and find a new paradigm from which to look those. And, different places are learning different things all the time. So I'm always fascinated to hear that. And I'm wondering, kind of, as you look at some of the problems you face now, are there things that you think are universal problems, or things that you think are much more localized, or kind of how you differentiate between these big kind of perhaps human problems and then the smaller community driven problems, or is there a distinction?
So I think that the smaller community driven problems are part of the bigger story about the universal challenges that humanity faces. So when you think about things like poverty and inequality and racism, those exist in different ways around the world. And those are often the problems that communities in their own specific and contextual way are taking on. And so, for example, a community in the US that is working to address poverty might start from a place of thinking about how to organize within public housing, for example, whereas in some of the places where I lived, like Tanzania or Uganda, where there are still large slums, often that organizing is not as necessary because people have already been living in really close quarters and tend to know each other really well. And so what they might do is begin to figure out how to bring attention to the work that they want to do, whether that's sort of sanitation focused, which is something that I saw a lot of people trying to organize around in Uganda, or whether that's around workforce and jobs. So I think where you start can certainly be affected by the local context, but I think it's all part of a bigger story that connects humanity across continents and oceans.
Well, as you've been doing this for a few years now, I'm wondering, kind of, as you look back, is there something that you've learned that's been particularly impactful, or something unexpected that now kind of changes the way you think about things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the racial equity and inclusion journey that we've been on has been really eye-opening for me, because I think that we have all been taught in sort of professional settings, at least in sort of Western professional settings, and that influence certainly exists across the world as well. But I think that we've been taught that there's a time and a place for conversations about things like race, and that certain contexts it's not appropriate to talk about those issues. And I kind of bought into that, and I was able to be successful by sort of keeping my head down and doing my work, even though I was working largely for social change organizations that were focused on addressing issues like poverty. And it always struck me as bizarre that we never talked about race because of those intersections. But I kind of I kind of knew that culturally, that just was taboo, and you weren't really supposed to talk about it. And I think one of the things that has been most eye-opening for me, despite the enormous risk that I felt in beginning to discuss those issues with our CEO, which is our conversations, I think, were one of the contributing factors to getting us started on this journey. And one of the things that I took away from those conversations, as uncomfortable as they were, is that the normalizing of those conversations actually happens quite quickly, and that culture can change. And so I think that was one of the most surprising things for me, is that something that has just always been a given, and that even if you disagree with it, you just kind of feel like that's the way it is, how quickly that can change if you're willing to kind of jump in and take that risk. And if you've built transformational relationships where you feel like you can be honest with colleagues, which is another thing that sometimes is discouraged in the workplace, but I actually think has been really foundational to our ability to take on these conversations and issues.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm wondering, as you look at other organizations, is there a time and a place when you think they're most willing to deal that? Are there times that you've gone to a community or gone to an organization and you're like, I'm not sure you guys are ready for this conversation yet? Or is it something that kind of every community has to deal with, and whenever the time is right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that my answer is I don't know. I think I've been trying to figure out what is it about, I think before I started at Living Cities, there were a few other people, and particularly interestingly, women of color, who had tried to raise this question of the intersection of poverty and race, and how problematic it was that we, as a national institution doing this work, had a race-neutral approach. But for whatever reason, it didn't land at that time. And those women, in most cases, actually ended up leaving the organization because they just felt like they weren't going to be able to have the impact that they believed that they needed to have. And so I don't know what it was about the particular time that made it possible, or the particular set of circumstances that made it possible. And I've thought about it, and I have a few hypotheses in terms of what it took for us. I think one is the building of relationships, so that there's that trust. I think that is something that I've heard from others as well that's important, and respect among colleagues who are going to be having these difficult conversations. Another possible contributing factor is the sort of externalities. And so when I first raised the conversation with our CEO, it was at a time when the George Zimmerman verdict, not guilty verdict, had just come out in the killing of Trayvon Martin. And so I think tensions were high among staff. And I feel like in part, the sort of reality of what was happening around the country began to sort of normalize those conversations in some subtle ways. And so I think certainly sort of current events contributed to our ability and willingness to take it on. But as you said, I think it's different in every place. I've seen a lot of, we talk to organizations all the time who are trying to take these issues on. And often I come away from the conversation saying, oh, well, you're a long way away from actually meaningfully being able to take this on, because you're seeing it from a very technical perspective and not willing to sort of engage in the hard space. But I also know that we were there as an organization too at some point. And so taking that first step, no matter when it is and what sort of sparked it, I think is important. But yeah, I think the question of like, what are the right set of circumstances is a question that I don't have answered, and maybe there is no answer for.
Well, I'm intrigued also, we've worked in a number of different communities, and I'm wondering, as you travel from community to community, or when you're working with a new community, is there something that you look for to let you know kind of where that community is at that point? Is there either physical or institutional or psychological? Is there something that you look for that kind of tips you off that a place is doing well or that they're not doing well?
Well, I think one of the things that I look for when I go on site visits is the presence of community and conversations. And often it's more difficult to gauge from the physical environment what is happening in a place, but you can see how people are interacting with the physical environment and whether you're seeing sort of inclusion, whether that's in a park. I think parks are good places to sort of note who feels like public spaces are for them. And so I think, especially as we're seeing sort of the cops being called on Black people in Oakland who are barbecuing, like that, those kinds of things where you kind of see like how people are engaging with public spaces, I think in terms of the physical environment is something that I might look for if I do get outside, which often on site visits, unfortunately, I don't. But the other thing again is like who is being invited to the table. And so when I go to kind of observe or participate in meetings of the cross-sector collaboratives that we support, I am always heartened when I see that community members have been engaged in the decision making from the beginning and that they are full participants at the table. I think that generally signifies the potential for real change.
Yeah, but I really like it.
Well, I would love to talk to you about this all day, but I wonder if you could kind of close us out with a story about what can happen when communities really deal with this issue and kind of what successes look like maybe in one of the situations that you've worked with.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest sort of elements of success that we've seen in many of the cities that we're working with is seeing local government really working together with communities and community organizations in particular who maybe would have been adversarial to them in the past. So that has been sort of really exciting over the years to see how the partnerships at these tables have really deepened and how that has translated into meaningful change in those places, whether that's through the changing of policy. We've seen a lot of the cities that we work with adopt sort of ban the box type policies, or whether that looks like working really hard, as they did in New Orleans, to connect African American men who had previously been left out of the workforce, and to explicitly name race as a goal in terms of what they're trying to do there. And they really have sort of a thriving initiative now of workforce development that is specifically focused on the African male population, with a diversity of partners engaged there. And so, yeah, I think those are the kinds of things that make us really excited about what's possible as we continue to support these efforts around the country.
Well, very good. Thank you so much for taking the time, Nadia. And if people are interested in learning more about what you guys are up to, where can they find more information?
Livingcities.org.
Wonderful. And if you guys are interested in learning more about CityWorks Expo, you can find us at cityworksxpo.com. But again, thank you so much for taking the time today, Nadia.
Thank you for having me.
Once again, thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. We truly hope you've enjoyed today's episode and come away thinking more deeply about something than you were before. If you have, we'd appreciate a rating or review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you might be listening to this. It really helps other people find out about the podcast and the great guests that we have on. Further, I'd like to welcome all of you all to check us out on CityWorks XPO, that's cityworksxpo.com, and learn about our annual gathering, CityWorks 8, where this year's theme is Anticipating 2050, Acting Today. We're really excited about what we have going on this year and some of the speakers that we have coming in, and we hope you'll join us in Roanoke, Virginia from October 4th through 6th and be part of what's really a very special event. But for now, thanks again for listening and have a great week.